Have you ever just had this feeling that something is fundamentally off? Like all our public conversations have gotten incredibly loud, but also completely empty at the same time. We're all shouting, but nobody's really listening. Well, if you felt that, you are definitely not alone. So let's try to get to the bottom of this feeling to understand what's really going on here. This quote from Nick Sasaki, whose work we're diving into, just nails it. It perfectly captures that feeling. I mean, think about it. We are swimming in opinions, drowning in hot takes, but real judgment, that slow, thoughtful, difficult process of actually thinking things through, that seems to be getting rarer and rarer. So that's the big question, isn't it? And to explore it, we're going to use this incredible idea from the source, an imaginary roundtable. Picture some of the greatest minds in history, all gathered in one room to figure out what's gone wrong in our time. The goal here isn't to find some easy fix. It's about learning how to ask much, much better questions. Okay, let's start with the first and maybe the biggest crisis of them all, the crisis of truth. Our guide for this part of the conversation is the philosopher Hannah Arendt, and she kicks things off with a pretty chilling warning. Societies don't collapse from violence first. They collapse from confusion, from the moment we can no longer agree on what is real. So this is the question Arendt throws on the table, and it cuts right to the bone. Because if we can't agree on basic facts, then how can we hold anyone accountable for anything? What happens to a society when my truth becomes more important than the truth? And right away, you see two completely different ways of looking at this. On one side, you've got Karl Popper. For him, the whole point of truth is that we can test it, we can challenge it, we can prove it wrong. That's how we make progress. He says power loves it when you can't question anything. But then, on the other side, Jean-Francois Lyotard argues that what we've called truth with a capital T has often just been a big story used to control people. For him, being honest means admitting there's no single grand narrative that works for everyone. And this is Arendt's absolutely devastating conclusion to that first debate. It just shows you how high the stakes are. Look, we can handle lies, we can argue about different interpretations of the facts, but when the very foundation of a shared reality crumbles away, when the ground beneath our feet disappears, we're not even having an argument anymore. We're just shouting into different universes. So, from the crisis of truth, we move right into the next piece of the puzzle, the crisis of power. Our moderator for this part is Michel Foucault, and he points out something fascinating. He says power doesn't really work by shouting orders anymore. It whispers, it suggests, it nudges. It's gotten so good at what it does that we often think its choices were our own ideas. So this is the real dilemma Foucault puts out there. If the very words we use, the unspoken rules we all follow, even the things we want most in life, if all of that is shaped by forces we can't even see, then where does real freedom even start? Is there any part of us left that is truly, authentically our own? And you can see the tension right here. On the one hand, you have Jean-Paul Sartre, who says, look, you are radically, terrifyingly free, and any attempt to blame the system is just an excuse. Freedom is the unbearable burden of knowing you always have a choice. But then Herbert Marcuse pushes back hard. He says, hold on, how can you choose freely when the alternatives are made invisible, when the system creates both the cage and the comfortable distractions inside it? Foucault ends this part with a truly haunting thought. He says the ultimate control isn't being locked up or even being made comfortable in your chains. It's normalization. It's when the current way of doing things feels so normal, so natural, that you literally can't even imagine a different way to live. That's when invisible power has truly won. Which leads us to the third and final part of the diagnosis, the crisis of meaning. Our guide here is Simone Weil, and she starts things off not with a big theory, but with a simple plea for pure, unfiltered attention. The whole mood kind of shifts here, as we start to ask, why does so much of our culture feel so shallow? This is the question she poses, and man, does it ever hit home today. We talk all the time about the attention economy, right? But what are the deeper costs? What do we lose as people, as a culture, when we can no longer focus or reflect or just be still? So there are two different ideas here for why we feel this way. On the left, George Santayana says we're suffering from a kind of cultural amnesia. When we don't pay attention, we forget who we are, where we came from, we're spiritually empty. But on the right, Roland Barthes says the problem isn't forgetting, it's saturation. We're so overloaded with information, with content, with stuff, that nothing can feel important anymore. Meaning just gets suffocated by all the noise. And this brings us to Weil's incredibly profound point. She suggests that real meaning, real depth, requires something our world has almost no patience for: waiting. To wait is to be vulnerable, to not know what's coming next. But without that vulnerability, she says, we're just left with surfaces touching other surfaces, never really connecting with anything or anyone in a deep way. Okay, so, wow. We've looked at these massive crises of truth, power, and meaning. It's a lot, and it's easy to feel pretty overwhelmed right about now. But we're not going to end there. We're now going to shift from diagnosing the problem to asking a different question. What can we actually do about it? What is the most radical act we have left? So the first step is to really understand what we're up against. And it's so easy to blame politicians or Silicon Valley or the economy. But the argument here is that those are all just symptoms. They're not the actual disease. The real problem, the core diagnosis, is that the crisis is existential. This is about us. It's about how we live, how we make sense of our own lives, and who we're becoming in a world that rewards us for being fast instead of thoughtful, and certain instead of curious. The problem is at the very root of how we exist. And from that diagnosis comes a prescription. But it's not a new law or a new app. It's a personal practice, a way of being. First, resist the temptation of easy answers. Second, embrace complexity, even when it's messy and uncomfortable. And third, and this is the big one, start treating the very act of thinking not just as something you do, but as a core ethical duty. And that's the final powerful idea we're left with. You know, in a world that is practically begging to do our thinking for us, with algorithms and outrage and simple slogans, maybe the most rebellious, most human thing you can do is to take that act back, to slow down, to pay attention, and to take on the hard, necessary work of real judgment for yourself. The only question left is, are you willing to do it?